All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the Course Technology JavaScript 6th edition text. I'm now on Chapter 5 of 12, which is working with the DOM, or Document Object Model, and DHTML. A little bit longer chapter here. Our objectives: we want to be able to access elements by ID, tag name, class, name, or selector, access element content, CSS properties and attributes, add and remove document nodes, create and close new browser tabs and windows within an app, use the set timeout and set interval methods to specify or delay a duration, use the history, location, navigation, and screen objects to manipulate the browser window. All right. We may have talked about this before, we may not have, I'm not real sure. But to JavaScript, everything on the web page is an object, and the web page itself is also an object. So you have an object or objects inside of an object. You can also create your own objects. For example, each function is an object. So before we talk about the DOM, the document object model, let's talk about the BOM, which is the browser object model. All right. And as you can see right here, the BOM is a hierarchy of objects. Now it says each provides programmatic access. What does that mean? Literally what it means is that you're able to manipulate anything in the BOM using JavaScript programming. So we've got the window object, and we've talked a little bit about that before when we talked about using alerts. And remember how we said we could use window.alert, but because window is known as the global object, all right, we technically don't have to put window dot in front of anything. As it says, all other browser object model objects are contained within the browser window. And there's a look at it. So these are all things in the BOM that you're able to manipulate. Now think about what these things in here are. The first one is history, which, as you can guess, kind of provides your browser history. So in other words, you can go forward pages, backward pages, etc. Location, kind of where you are. Navigator, to allow you to peruse your way around. Screen, which literally is the screen object, and document, which we've already looked at in a little more depth and breadth of coverage when we talked about the document object, when we use things like document.write. So the document object represents the web page. It's got everything that's on the web page. JavaScript, as it says, everything that's on a web page literally gets its own object. Now, way back in, I think it was Chapter 1, we talked about the fact that users today, people who are using websites, want dynamicity. They want to be able to have things change on a website based on, information that they give it, or whatever is current, or whatever. All right, so dynamic HTML, also known as DHTML, notice what it says. It can change current content of a web page without reloading. So you don't have to spend a lot of time constantly unloading and reloading pages. Notice that it is a combination of everything that we've been talking about in this class. That is hypertext markup language, cascading style sheets, and JavaScript. All right. So the DOM, which we're going to get into right now, the DOM is an example of an API, or application program interface. I've talked about this before. I want to say it again. What an API is, kind of in general terms, if you can imagine that somebody gives you a contract and asks you to sign it, and they say, okay, we're going to give you this contract, and after you sign or agree to this contract, what's going to happen is you're going to have this, and this, a bunch of different stuff that you can use. But one of the things in the contract says that you're going to use them in the right way. In other words, in the way we tell you to use them. That's kind of like what an API is. An API is sort of an unwritten agreement between you and software, where the software says, okay, I'm going to allow you to use these different components that I have, these different software components, but you're agreeing that you're going to use them in the way that they are meant to be used. All right, so they say here it's a structure of objects with a set of properties. So when you go and you create a web page, and here is an example, I think it's also shown in the book here someplace, but the point is when you go in and you create a web page, this is on the bottom of page 293 and the top of page 294, I believe. What happens behind the scenes is something like this gets created. All right? Now, they say there that it's an example of a DOM tree. It's a hierarchical arrangement. So it says, here's your document. Under your document, the child is an HTML. The HTML element has two children. It has a head element and it has a body element. And you'll notice that the head element has two elements, a meta element and a title element. The body element has two elements, a header and an article. All right? The meta element has got a char set. That's an attribute, so that's a part of the meta tag. The title has got some text, which says photo gallery, because that's what you're going to see up in the tab. The header has an H1 child, an H1 element, that again has a text element underneath it that says garden photo. Article has a child that says figure, and we already know that figures contain figure captions and they contain images, so that's the two direct descendants of the figure. The figure caption has a text child that says butterfly bush, and the image has both the source file attribute and the alt attribute. So as you go and create the web page here, in the background, the DOM is being created right here. So each item in the DOM tree is referred to as a node. Some of these nodes go on. So that's a node, but notice it's got nodes underneath it. But notice at the bottom, at the very bottom, everything that you have either says attribute or it says text. Those are known as leaf nodes, L-E-A-F, because they have no descendants. They're at the bottom of the chain, so to speak. So when the DOM is created, as it says there, the element node, the attribute node, and the text content node are the ones you're going to use almost exclusively. So why do you want to use these? Because anything that's in here, anything, which basically is the entire web page, you can now manipulate programmatically using any of the methods that you see right here. This is about, I think, as important as it gets. This is the table that's shown in your book on page 295. The first thing to realize when you look at all these, I'm not going to read each one of them to you right now, but when you look at each one of these, they are case sensitive. So notice the first one, get element by ID. The G in get, the E in element, the B in by, and the I in ID are capitalized. The D in ID is not capitalized, and that's a mistake many programmers make. Same kind of thing with the get elements by class name. Please notice though, get element, singular, so it returns a single element, all right, by that ID. Get elements with an S by class name. That will grab every element that adheres to the class name that we put in. Get elements by name. as it says, returns a collection of elements with that name. Get elements, again, by tag name. So for instance, if I wanted all li tags, all right, query selector all returns the collection of elements that match the CSS selector that you put in here. And write, which writes text to the document. So what you're going to learn in here, or start to learn in here, is how to programmatically manipulate your web page using the document object model. So not only does the DOM have object methods, again, methods are behaviors or functions, so to speak, that you can run, but it also has properties. And this is the table that's shown on the top of page 296. Some of them you should be able to look at and they should just make sense. Body, URL, etc. Some of them you may or may not have heard before, like referrer, the URL of the document that provided a link to the current document. What we've done thus far in the little bit of manipulation that we've done using JavaScript, we have not been actually manipulating the web page programmatically. We've been using JavaScript pretty much so far as you would any other kind of programming language. All right, we went back, if you remember, in the last chapter, and we did a little debug exercise where we were working on a person's payroll, figuring out their net pay after getting their gross pay and taking off for state and federal and FICA and Medicare and all the other good stuff. All right? We did things like enter in a number and say whether it was odd or even, but we have not exactly manipulated what is on the web page itself. One of the best ways of doing it, and best I put double quotes around it, but let's put it this way, probably one of the most powerful ways of manipulating a web page is DOM, or document object programming. And if you get nothing else out of this lecture, other than it, for lack of better words, it piques your curiosity and it gets you started on the road to wanting to learn more about this, I've started to do my job. So as it says, things like get element by ID are methods of the document object. Okay, several methods available for JavaScript to reference web page elements. Again, get element by ID. So if we go and create an input element, for instance, this is a zip code element. We could have said type text, but we're saying type number right there, which means that it'll only accept numbers. I don't think this will even accept a dash, but I could be wrong on that. But the key thing is you give it an ID. Now, this is a little bit of an aside here, but normally when you give something an ID, you also give it a name. And most of the time, unless you're working with radio buttons and the like, the ID and the name value will be the same. But we don't need a name here, but we do need an ID, because that ID of zip is the same one that you will use in get element by ID. So we're saying for the document object, use the get element by ID and find me the element with an ID of zip. So it's going to find you that element. Then we're using that value and we're setting a local variable called zip field to that value. Now that's fine and dandy for a single element. All right? But then notice the next one here says get elements. All right? Get elements, plural, by tag name. All right? So it returns an array of elements. I guess it's technically not an array, but it's something that you can use as an array. And that tag name is the name of the element. So it's going to return a set. It could be as few as none. So if I said by tag name and I put a tag in there, maybe I asked for all p tags and there weren't any p tags. Or I could have, multiple p tags on a page and it would return all of them to me. All right. And everything, remember, that's on the web page, they're all nodes. So when we return all of these p tags, for example, we're returning what's called a node list. And as it says right there, a node list is an indexed collection of nodes. That's where the array-like structure comes in because it's indexed. All right. And there's different ways that you can work with this stuff. So here's an example. These index numbers, we learned this in an earlier chapter, that for computers, we oftentimes use our first number rather than it being 1, it's 0. So the index numbers start at 0. So if you wanted to work with the second HI element on a page, they're showing you here how you could do it. But again, it's get elements by tag name. So you're saying to get all elements, all H1 elements, but the only one we want is the second one, which is element 1. And we're going to take that again. We're going to assign it to a local variable. All right. Sometimes what you want to do is you're not concerned with all P tags or all H1 tags or whatever. Sometimes what you're concerned with is all elements that have a certain class name assigned to them. So when you use the get elements by class name, as is shown right here, it again returns an HTML collection of elements, also known as a node list. So if I had said, for example, my class, all right, or here's an example. This says find every element that has a class associated with it of side, and grab all those elements and put them into a collection that's called side elements. Again, that side elements could be as small as having nothing in it, or it could be as large as having all sorts of stuff in it, depending on what met your criteria. Class attributes take multiple values. So get elements by class method takes multiple arguments. So here's an example. This is all elements with class either of side, all right, with the values of side and of green. All class names provided as arguments must be enclosed in a set of quotes. Now, really all modern browsers support the get elements by class name, except for IE8. And I don't know if you even call IE8 anymore if you would call that a modern browser. Next is accessing elements by name. As you can see, it returns a node list, or again, an HTML collection of elements that match the name attribute that you add. Now notice it says it's not as not as useful as the preceding things, all right, but it can be more concise. The bottom line is, if you're provided 4, 5, 6, whatever ways of doing something, are you going to use all 6? You might try all 6 to see which one or ones are the most useful for you, and by and large, those are going to be the ones that you're going to use. You could access elements with CSS selectors. Now, CSS selectors will become more and more important as you continue your journey to becoming a web developer, web programmer, web designer, web whatever. Because CSS selectors are used, for example, not only here, but also in jQuery, which is a JavaScript library. So this selector that you put in there is any type of valid selector. So it returns the first occurrence of an element matching a selector. So you can see we're being very literal here. We're saying inside of the header element, find me inside of an H1 element, find me the first image. And that's exactly what it's going to find. Again, many of these things are not supported by earlier browsers or earlier versions of browsers. The query selector all, now remember we looked at query selector, that returns just the first occurrence. The query selector all returns a collection of elements as opposed to the query selector which just returns the first one. So if we used this query selector all nav ul li, that would say show me all the li's inside of a ul inside of a nav. But if instead of query selector all, which is going to return all three of these, if we just said query selector nav ul li, it would only return the first one, which is about us. All right. So the DOM also provides ways for you to access and modify content. So notice it says it accesses and it changes content that an element contains. So what I could do is while the program is running, literally, all right, so I could have interactivity where I could, for example, decide I wanted to change the text of a paragraph. Or as they show in the example in here, maybe I want to change what's inside of li tags or something else. Now, a key thing is when you look at that second sub-bullet there, it says, unlike inner HTML, which has been used for years, text content strips out HTML tags. The reason that that's important is for security reasons. You should get used to using text content property whenever possible rather than inner HTML. Because inner HTML leaves you vulnerable to different kinds of security attacks. All right, where someone places an inner HTML value in code that includes, for example, malicious JavaScript. Again, notice not supported by earlier browsers. To access an element's CSS properties, you can access them rather using dot notation. And as we learned earlier, this type of thing in here is also referred to as chaining. All right. So what we're saying is we want to grab the ID of logo. And for that ID, we want to change its style and we want to set its display to none. Right? Remember, when you say display none, what that does is it makes something, for lack of better words, invisible. Now, sometimes with CSS properties, remember, we're combining here CSS and JavaScript. And JavaScript is a programming language. So you can't say something like font family like this. You've got to change it to this. And the reason for that is when JavaScript sees font minus sign family, what it thinks is that you're doing a subtraction. So it thinks you're trying to subtract family from font, which of course it is not what it means. But by changing this to this and using it like this, you're leaving no room for doubt. Now in that case, what it's doing is it's going and it's finding the logo ID and it's grabbing from its style, it's grabbing its font family, which could be one font or it could be several fonts. And it's taking that and it's assigning it to a local variable called font. They also mention here, as it says, the CSS style using the DOM reference is an inline style. So when we talk about cascading style sheets, and I mentioned it goes not from a major to a minor order, but from a minor to a major order, this is the highest priority, or just about the highest priority. All right. So here, what we did was we used what's called a get, because we're getting the font family and assigning it to a local variable. Here we're using it in what's called a set. So in the first case, the document.getElementById, etc. appeared on the right-hand side of an equal sign. So we were grabbing its value and assigning it to a local variable. In the second example, it appears on the left-hand side of an equal sign. So the first one is a get, also called an accessor. The second one is called a set, or it's also known as a mutator. You can also access an element's attributes. For example, something like the href attribute. Okay, maybe there was something in there that I wanted. So here's it referencing an element with an ID of home link. All right. And then, as it says, we can reference, if it's got an href associated with it, we can reference that too. So as it says, you can use it to look up an attribute value and assign it to a variable, or meaning that it's a get, or you can reassign its value, meaning that it's a set. Remember, when you say get element by ID, you're not changing it. You're getting it, so you're grabbing something that exists. All right? One exception for accessing element attributes, you must use the property name class name to refer to class attribute values. Notice a single class will return a single value, and multiple classes will be returned in a string, a space-separated string. So everything that's on or in the DOM, everything, is known as a node. So you can use the DOM to add and remove different types of nodes that are in a DOM tree. Why is that important? That means that all those text nodes that we saw before, where we had titles and all sorts of stuff, you can use the DOM to change those. You can also use the DOM to remove any node, and you can use the DOM to add new nodes. If you want to add new nodes, you create a new element by using the create element method. And you can see the syntax. So in the example that they show here, this would create a new div element. Now in the examples, and we'll go through as much of these as we have time for in class, but in those examples, you're constantly going through different example after example after example in here. And again, as always, that's the best way to learn. All right? So when you create a new element using the create element, it's there, but it's not part of the DOM yet. It's independent of the DOM. So you use the append child method to attach a node to the DOM tree, because what you're doing there is you're telling it where you want it to be attached. So you can see the syntax down toward the bottom of the slide here. That's, I don't know, I guess it's a smaller font. But you've got child node in the parentheses, that's the node to be attached, and parent node, and that's the node you want to attach the child node to. So here's an example. As it says, it creates a new li element and attaches it to an ID with a value of navlist. Now, if you're going to do this, typically, you might surround that or do an if statement first and make sure that indeed that exists. Because if it doesn't exist, it's going to return null, and that won't make any sense. A document fragment is defined right there as a set of connected nodes not part of a document. So again, you've created them, but you have not yet linked them up with the DOM. So you use the append child to add document fragments to a DOM tree for a document. They're showing it here. It's kind of a busy picture, for lack of better words. But you use a create element and kind of look at it that when you use the create element, for lack of better words, the DOM element is kind of in purgatory. And then you use the append child to add it back onto the DOM where you want it to go. Sometimes you want to create a new node that basically is the same or at least is very similar to something you've already got there. And rather than duplicating everything, you can use what's called the clone method. And that duplicates an existing node. You can see the syntax here. Existing node dot clone node. And when you do that, you can specify true or false. All right, notice if you say true, it clones all of the child nodes, but if you say false, it clones only the specified parent node. So they show you this process here, and the picture that you see here is also shown in your book on page 316. All right. The clone node here is stored in the directions variable. And it includes the class value main nav because clone node cloned all child nodes based on the argument that we added here that said true. So we did make it a true clone. All right. Inserting nodes at specified positions within a document tree. As we already learned, when you use create element to create a new node, that node is not attached to the document tree. Append child adds the node after an existing node. If you want to insert it in a different position, for example, you can use insert before. And then you're basically telling it where you want to insert the node. Okay, so you're saying insert that before this. What I like about this book, there's many things I like about this book, but one of the things I like about the book is quite often they'll show you something that looks like this, where they show you the HTML and then they show you the JavaScript to show you what it is they're about to do. And then they pictorially show it to you. So this is figure 514. So it's showing you on page 321 in the book exactly what's happening. In other words, you want some control. So what we want to do here is we want to use DOM programming where we previously had about us, order, and support. We want to add a new thing that says directions, but remember that by default it would go on the end. We want it to go at the beginning. So we use the insert before, and we tell it to insert it before the about us. Well, just like you want to insert nodes, at least on occasion, you may wish to remove nodes from the DOM tree. You can do this with the remove child method, and you can see the syntax. Parent node dot remove child, then with the name of the child node. The node then is removed without being assigned to a variable, is going to be deleted. All right, it's going to be deleted during garbage collection. So it's basically, it'll send a message to the system, oh, no one's using this anymore, so you can get rid of it. Again, there's a complex example in the book on 324 and 325 and 326. All right, and it shows you pictorially on 326 what's going on also. Manipulating the browser with the window object. We've talked a little bit about the window object before. Remember, it is the default object, so you don't have to say window dot. But the window object itself does include several properties with information about the web browser window or tab. Okay? Here are some of them. Notice, for example, There's the name property that contains the name of the current window or tab. There's other things that allow you to manipulate the web browser window or the tab itself. We've already looked at some of these. So I'm not going to sit there and read this to you, but please take a look at it. Again, the important thing, and one of the great things about the textbook that you have that we're using for these lectures, is the fact that it's a great reference. So he says, geez, I wonder if we can do this or we can do that. You go back to your book and take a look. So not only are there a lot of properties, but there are a lot of methods that you can use too. And again, these are shown on 327 and 328 in your book. All right. Now, another way that you can refer to the window object, and sometimes you'll want to do this, is to use what's called the self property. And self, as it says, refers to the current window. So both of these things are exactly the same thing. When you're in doubt, even if you don't have to preface something with window dot or self dot, a lot of books and a lot of developers will recommend that you do anyway. For consistency, for completeness, and to show people you know exactly what it is you're talking about. Opening and closing windows, which starts on the bottom of page 328 in the book. Most web browsers allow you to open windows, or web browser windows or tabs, in addition to ones that have already been opened. There are a lot of reasons you might want to do this. You might want to launch a new web page. You may want to use an additional window to display information like a picture or an order form, etc. Whenever a new web browser window or tab is opened, a new window object is automatically created to represent it. You can have as many web browser windows or tabs open as your system will support, which, take my word for it, would typically be a lot. You could even use simple HTML without any JavaScript to open up a new window. We've done this before. All right. Here they're giving it a target, but we've also said target equals underscore blank, for example. So this window open method has several properties and methods associated with it. So you can see the window.open, okay, and you can see that some of the options and some of the different stuff in here that you can use. Now, again, I think at least this is going to make a lot more sense when you go through some of these examples in class. The idea here is to just introduce you to what's going on. All right, so you can see an example here where we're actually opening up a window. So the statement right here will open the Wikipedia homepage in a new browser window or tab. If you exclude the URL, then a blank page opens. So if you just say window.open by itself, it'll open up a blank page. The table that you see here, which is also on page 330 in your book, lists some of the common options you can use with the open window method. So you can do things like set its height, set its width, etc. It says here the window.open method with a name argument. If the name is already in use, notice what it says. JavaScript changes focus to the existing web browser window rather than creating a new one. So if you've got a window open with a certain name and you try to use another window.open with that same name, rather than opening it and having two windows open that have the same name, what it'll do is it'll give the focus basically to the window that's already open. You can use the focus method to make a current window active. So you could have a lot of different windows that are technically open, but one only has the focus, or it's the active window at one time. In other words, it's the one displaying. But you can change that by using things like the focus method. Just like you can open a window, you can close a window. All right? And I will say, you might look at that and go, okay, I can use window.close or I can use self.close. I understand why I might want to use self. It's 2 less letters to key in. But there's other reasons that you might want to use self. What you're going to find as you go on is very many programming languages will use either self, or they might use the word this, or they might use something else. But they have different words that they use to refer to something. And that's another reason that you might want to at least start looking at this stuff. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. And we're going to move up all the way to page 338 and talk about timeouts and intervals. All right, now notice the second bullet here talks about set timeout. It executes code once after a specified amount of time. So imagine that you had a clock, not an alarm clock, but a clock. And when a time reached a certain time, maybe it literally announced it, it's 7 o'clock, it's 7 o'clock, it's 7 o'clock. Not like that's an alarm, because with an alarm you can hit snooze and then make it go off again in 10 minutes or so. But if you've got a one-time thing that you want to have happen, you can use set timeout. You can tell it how long to wait in milliseconds, where 1,000 milliseconds equals a second. And after that time has come out, you can say whatever code you want to have fire, you can tell it to fire. All right. If you decide, if the code hasn't executed yet, you don't want that to show anymore, you can clear the timeout. So I like to think about this in terms of like an alarm clock. So let's say I've got my alarm clock set for 6 a.m. and I wake up and it's 5:58. Well, I know I'm not going to go back to sleep for 2 minutes, so I might turn my alarm clock off. So I may have had a set timeout, or not set timeout, that at 6 o'clock it was supposed to go off. But I woke up before that, so I did a clear timeout by turning the alarm off. Now, sometimes you want these things to go off, but not just once, but on a regular basis, maybe every 5 minutes. All right, back in the day when I started getting into this field and I started teaching, before we even had Microsoft Word, we had a thing called WordPerfect. And by default, I believe with WordPerfect at the time, it would save whatever it was you were working on, like about every 15 minutes, if you didn't save yourself. So there was a set interval that said, hey, if I have not saved in the last 15 minutes and that time has now come up, save. Okay? Well, not only can you set intervals, if you decide you don't want to use them anymore, you can clear intervals. All right. Back at the beginning of the chapter, we talked about some of the other objects that we were going to talk about in this chapter, and one of them was the history object. All right. The document object, remember, is probably the most important child of the window object, but if you remember from the beginning of the chapter, and I'm not going to go back, but we looked at that picture. In fact, we can go back. We looked at this picture, right? Come on, there you go. So we've talked a lot about the document object, but let's talk a little bit about the history, location, navigator, and screen objects. So the history object, as mentioned right there, it maintains a history list, which is basically an internal list of all documents that have been opened during the current web browser session. Each browser window contains its own internal history object. You can't view the URLs contained in the history list, but you can write a script that uses that list to navigate to pages that have been opened. Now think about it. You may or may not want to do this, but think about why, for example, someone else may want to do this. If I am working at a website and I want to be able to see if you've gone out and you're looking at my website, I may want to know what pages you're perusing to. What pages are you spending the most time at? Why would I want to do that? Because if I notice that there is a trend, maybe I've got 10 pages in my site, but I've got one page that no one is ever going to. I may either want to remove that page or change it so people want to go to the page. If I see that there's one page that people are heading to all the time, I might want to look at that page and see what it has that other pages don't have. So the history object has three basic methods that you can use with it. The back method, which is like clicking the back button. The forward method, which is like clicking the forward button. And the go, which opens a specific document in a history list. Okay, so I can say, for example, go 5, all right, which I believe will open the 5th document. Then if I want to go back again, I can even put under the go, I believe I can put a negative number in there. The history object also contains just one property, one. It's called the length property. It contains the specific number of documents that have been opened during the current browser session. So you use it via history.length. So again, as it says, if I want to go to the first document I open in the current browser section, I can use this. So that's the history object. Let's talk a little bit about the location object. And I'm on 343 if you're following along in the book. When you want to allow users to open one web page from another web page, you typically create a link within the A element. You can also use JavaScript and the location object to open web pages. So what this location object does, as mentioned right here, is it allows you to change to a new page, but do it within JavaScript code. All right, the location object has different properties that allow you to modify the individual portions of a URL. Here you can see the properties in table 5.8, which is on the middle of page 343. Ideally, at least, when you look at those, most of the things that are in there are pretty self-explanatory. You also notice that you've got three methods. The assign to load a new page, the reload, which causes the page that's currently in there to open again, and the replace, which replaces the currently loaded URL with a different URL. So as mentioned here, the assign method is the same thing basically as changing the href property because it's going to load a new page. The reload method is equivalent to hitting that refresh button because it causes the current page to open again. And the replace replaces the currently loaded URL with a totally different one. The Navigator object, which starts on the middle of page 344, it's used to obtain information about the current browser. Some browsers support unique methods and properties of the Navigator object that cannot be used with other browsers. The major properties are shown right here. What used to be really popular was something that was referred to as browser sniffing. So what you could do as a developer is you could write code so when a person came into your website, you could look at what browser they were using, what platform or operating system they were using, etc. There are other ways of doing that today that are much easier to do it. All right, so, but in the past, the Navigator object was used to determine the browser that was running. So you could show one thing for people who were in Firefox versus another for people who were in IE, etc. But today, most of this stuff is standardized, so browser sniffing is rarely used. Plus, it's, it doesn't always give you a lot of information anyway, just because of the fact that when you're working with this stuff, there are so many different versions of so many different browsers. All right, you could spend all of your time literally trying to come in and write code for every version of every browser there was, but that would probably be hundreds of things you'd have to account for. Here's an example of how it can be used. All right, and finally we've got the screen object. Computer displays vary widely. All right, depending on the size of the monitor, the type of the graphics card, the screen resolution, the color depth, etc. So you can use the screen object to obtain information about the display that you're currently using. Again, its screen size, its resolution, and its color depth. If we look here, here are the available properties that you have. And these should be supported by virtually every, let's just say, newer browser. Here's some, as it says, common screen object properties. Why would you want to do this? Well, if you knew the size of your user's display, you may, for example, want to take what you're going to display on their page and you may want to customize it based on the size of the screen that's available. So to summarize what we've talked about in this chapter is we started with the BOM, the browser object model, and we went to the DOM, and virtually the entire chapter, other than a little bit at the beginning, was on the DOM. Remember, the DOM, the document object model, represents the web page. Every time you create a web page behind the scenes, invisible to you if you want to say that, a document object model gets created. You can programmatically add to that document object model, update that current document object model, and remove things from that current document object model. We looked at some of the get functions, and remember, get are typically you're grabbing something but you're not changing it. All right, we looked at text content versus inner HTML. We looked at how to create a new element or a new node using create element. We learned that that element node when you create it is kind of in limbo, so you attach it with append child. We learned that if you want to basically copy one element to another, you can use clone node. We learned that by default it'll typically put something on the end, but if you want to put it in a certain place, you can use insert before. We learned how to remove nodes, how to open and close new windows, or open new windows and close existing windows. We talked about timeouts, which are a one-time timer, and how they can be cleared if they haven't gone off yet and you don't want it anymore. We also talked about intervals, which will repeat something at a set interval, and again, how you can cancel that if you want to. From there, we went on and talked about the history object, all right, which is a fairly small object, again, to maintain an internal list, a history list of open documents. A location object, which allows you to change to a new web page using Java code. A navigator object, which allows you to get information about the current web browser. And we ended with the screen object, all right, which gives you information about the display screen size, resolution, etc. Now that's it. So in the next chapter, we're going to go over forms, all right, and how to enhance and how to validate forms, but this time, how to enhance and validate them using JavaScript. So we'll be back with that particular lecture in just a couple minutes.